children are missing. Thus almost all families have been torn apart. In these circumstances it must be very doubtful if the remaining craftsmen are enthusiastic about their work and produce accordingly, the more so in that at the moment they are still walking around with faces beaten bloody on account of the brutality. The White Russians, whose full trust had been won, stood there aghast. Although they are intimidated and do not dare to express their opinions freely, one nonetheless hears it said that this day represented no page of glory for Germany and that it will never be forgotten. I am of the opinion that through this action much has been destroyed that we had achieved over the last months, and that it will be a long time before we can again win the trust of the population. In conclusion, I find myself compelled to point out that during the action, the police battalion plundered in an outrageous way, and indeed not only in Jewish houses but just as much in the houses of the White Russians. They took with them anything useful, such as boots, leather textiles, gold, and other valuables. According to the accounts of members of the army, watches were torn from the arms of Jews publicly in the streets, rings were pulled off fingers in the most brutal way. One senior paymaster reported that a Jewish girl was ordered by the police immediately to fetch 5,000 rubles, then her father would be released. This girl is said to have run around everywhere trying to get the money. Also within the ghetto, the individual barracks that were nailed shut by the civil administration and provided with a Jewish inventory were broken into and robbed by the police. Even in the barracks in which the unit was lodged, window frames and doors were torn out for the campfire. Even though I had a talk with the commander's adjutant on Tuesday morning concerning the plundering, and he promised me, in the course of the conversation, that no police would henceforth enter the city. Several hours later I was forced once again to arrest 2 fully armed Lithuanians because they were caught looting. On the night of Tuesday to Wednesday, the battalion left the city in the direction of Branovici. The population was manifestly happy as the news spread through the city. So much for the report. I will come to Minsk in the near future in order once again to discuss the matter orally. At the moment I am not able to continue the Jewish action. First, peace must return. I hope to be able to restore peace as quickly as possible and, despite the difficulties, to revive the economy. I now ask only that one request be granted me. In the future spare me, without fail, from this police battalion. Karl 28. Though the documentation of police battalion participation in the mass murder of Russian Jewry is not extensive, it does suffice to disprove beyond any reasonable doubt the chief post-war alibi of the Order Police leadership, namely, that Dallowitz had reached an agreement with Himmler, whereby the Order Police would assist the security police, providing guard duty and any services short of shooting, but were forbidden to be the executioners themselves. This alibi, akin to the post-war claim of the Waffen-SS that they were soldiers like any others, and did not participate in the ideologically grounded programs of the rest of the SS, was successfully pleaded before at least one German court in the trial of Police Battalion 11. The defendants persuaded the court that after only 2 executions upon army orders in the Minsk region they were able to invoke Dallowitz's arrangement to secure their recall to Kovno. 29. As the documentation shows, the direct participation of the Order Police in the mass executions of Russian Jews in the summer and fall of 1941 was pervasive, occurring within the jurisdictions of the Northern Central and Southern HSSPFs as well as in Białystok. Moreover, the mid-July massacre in Białystok took place directly after Dallowitz and Himmler met there with Bok-Zelewski, and the September 1st massacre in Minsk occurred immediately after Dallowitz's visit with Bok-Zelewski in that city. Clearly Dallowitz was not forbidding, but rather inciting Order Police participation in the mass murder. Order Police involvement in mass shootings in Russia after the fall of 1941 is not well documented, and in all probability was much less frequent. The major exception was extensive Order Police participation in the shooting of Jews in the Pinsk region in the fall of 1942-30. In the military crisis of the 1941-42 winter, many police battalions were pressed into frontline duty. Others had to contend with growing partisan resistance. Moreover, the number of men recruited from native populations into auxiliary units under the Order Police increased nearly tenfold in 1942, from 33,000 to 300,000. 31 There was a constant tendency to assign the actual shooting duties to these units in order to shift the psychological burden from the German police to their collaborators. This psychological burden was serious and extended even to Bach-Zelewski himself. Himmler's SS doctor, reporting to the Reichsführer on Bach-Zelewski's incapacitating illness in the spring of 1942, noted that the SS leader was suffering especially from visions in connection with the shootings of Jews that he himself had led, and from other difficult experiences in the East. 32. For the Order Police, and the final solution. Deportation. Just as the role of the Order Police in the massacre of Russian Jewry was beginning to wind down, in the fall of 1941, Daluege took on a new and vital assignment, contributing to the final solution: guarding the deportation trains to the east. In late September 1941, Hitler approved the commencement of Jewish deportations from the Third Reich, to be organized by Reinhard Heydrich, through his Jewish expert in Berlin, Adolf Eichmann, and the regional security police offices throughout Germany. The only exceptions, on the local level, were in Vienna and Prague, where the deportations were to be handled by the Central Agencies for Jewish Emigration, created by Eichmann before the war, and staffed by his hand-picked men. Almost immediately, Heydrich reached agreement with Daluege on a 26 division of labor. Daluege's Order Police would guard the transports that Heydrich's security police organized. Before each deportation wave, the local Order Police were instructed to accommodate security police requests for the agreed-upon transport guards. Ordinarily, the Order Police supplied 1 officer and 15 men to each transport. What was the scale of these operations? Between the fall of 1941 and the spring of 1945, over 260 deportation trains took German, Austrian, and Czech Jews directly to the ghettos and death camps in the east, i.e., Poland and Russia, or to the transit ghetto of Theresienstadt north of Prague, and from there to the east. 3 A minimum of 147 trains from Hungary, 87 from Holland, 76 from France, 63 from Slovakia, 27 from Belgium, 23 from Greece, 11 from Italy, 7 from Bulgaria, and 6 from Croatia. That is, close to 450 additional trains from Western and Southern Europe were taken over by German guards at some point in their journey, for no estimate has even been made of the number of Jewish deportation trains that traveled from Polish cities to the nearby death camps, but it was clearly in the many hundreds. Virtually all of these trains were guarded by Order Police. What did this mean in terms of what the Order Police experienced? One graphic report by Lieutenant Paul Salader on guarding a deportation train from Dusseldorf to Riga on December 11, 1941 has already been published in both English and German. 5 2 other reports on deportation trains from Vienna to SOBIB 6R and from Katomiu in Galicia to Bifzik are noteworthy for an understanding of what numerous Order Police units did more than 1,000 times during the war. First, the Vienna Transport 152D Police Precinct Vienna, June 20, 1942 Report of Experiences. Subject: Transport Commando for the Jewish Transport Vienna Spangbahnhof to Sobibdr, June 14, 1942. The Transport Commando consisted of Reserve Lieutenant Fishman as leader, 2 sergeants, and 13 reserve policemen of the 1st Reserve Police Company East. The duty of the Transport Commando began at 11 a.m. on June 14, 1942, at the Spangbahnhof, in accordance with the prior telephone request of SS Hauptsturmführer Brunner 1. The loading of the Jews, under the direction and supervision of SS Hauptsturmführer Brunner and SS Hauptscharführer Surzik of the Central Agency for Jewish Emigration, the loading of the Jews into the special train waiting in the Spangbahnhof began at noon and went smoothly. The guard duty of the Transport Commando commenced at this time. A total of 1,000 Jews were deported. The transfer of the Jews, as listed, occurred at 4 p.m. Because of a shortage of cars, the Transport Commando had to make do with a third instead of a second-class car. Trip from Vienna to Sobibor. The train DA-38 was dispatched from Vienna at 7:08 p.m. on June 14, 1942, and traveled to Sobibor, not as scheduled, to Izbica, via Lundenburg left bracket, Fekler right bracket, Brünn left bracket, Brno right bracket, Nice left bracket, Nissa right bracket, Uppeln left bracket, Opole right bracket, Czestochowa, Kielsrodom, Deblin Lublin, and Chelm. Arrival in Sobibor on June 17, 1942, at 8:05 a.m. On arrival in Lublin, at 9 p.m. on June 16, SS Obersturmführer Pohl was waiting for the train at the station, and had 51 Jews capable of work, between the ages of 15 and 50, removed from the train, and taken to a work camp. At the same time, he gave the order to take the remaining 949 Jews to the work camp in SOBIB 6R. Both lists of names, 3 wagons of baggage with food supplies, as well as 100,000 zlotys, were turned over to SS Obersturmführer Pohl in Lublin. At 11 p.m., the train departed from Lublin for SOBIB 6R. At the Jewish camp in Troniki, some 30 kilometers beyond Lublin, the 3 baggage wagons and food supplies were surrendered to SS Schriftführer Meyerhofer. 3. Delivery of the Jews in SOBIB 6R. At 8:15 a.m. on June 17, the train drove into the work camp next to the SOBIB 6R train station, where the camp commandant, First Lieutenant Stangl, took delivery of the 949 Jews. The unloading of the train cars began immediately, and was completed by 9:15 a.m. Trip from SOBIB 6R to Vienna. The return trip in the special train began about 10 a.m. immediately after the completion of the unloading of the Jews from SOBIB 6R to Lublin, where we arrived at 2:30 a.m. on June 18. No travel expenses were paid for this train. The trip continued from Lublin at 8:13 a.m. on June 18 by regularly scheduled express train to KRAK 6W, where we arrived at 5:30 p.m. on the same day. In KRAK 6W, we billeted with the 3rd Company of Reserve Police Battalion 74. On June 19, this company handed out 1 day's rations to each of the 16 men. From KRAK 6W, the return trip was again continued on a regularly scheduled express train at 8:08 p.m. on June 19. Arrival in Vienna East train station at 6:30 a.m. On June 20, 5. The Transport Commando stopover in Krakow. The stopover of the Transport Commando in KRAK 6W lasted 2 hours 6, crossing the border. The special train crossed the border between the Reich and the General Government on the outward journey on June 15 at 1:45 p.m. The regularly scheduled express train on the return trip at 12:15 a.m. on June 20, 7. Provisions. The men of the Transport Commando were provided with cold rations for 4 days. This consisted of sausage, bread, marmalade, and butter, but was nonetheless not sufficient. In KRAK 6W, the daily ration of the 3rd Company of Reserve Battalion 74 was good and sufficient. 8. Suggestions. In future it will be necessary to provide the men of the Transport Commando with marching rations, because the cold rations do not keep in the summer months. The sausage, it was a soft sausage, was already opened and cut up when handed out on June 15, and had to be consumed no later than the 3rd day, because of the danger of spoiling. On the 4th day, the men had to be satisfied with marmalade, because the butter was also already rancid due to the tremendous heat in the train car. The size of the ration was also rather meager. 9. Incidents. No incidents occurred either on the outward journey, the stopovers in the train stations, or the return trip. Signed, Fishman Precinct Lieutenant of the Schutzpolizei. 6. The deportation of largely unsuspecting Viennese Jews, most of them elderly and/or female, passed with so little incident that Lieutenant Fishman could concentrate on the hardships of a third rather than second-class car, insufficient rations, and the summer heat that spoiled his butter. No mention, of course, was made of what the incarcerated Jews, without food or water, must have been suffering in the closed cattle cars during the 61-hour journey. But Fishman was quite conscious, as he delivered 949 Jews to the alleged work camp in Sobibor, that the Jews selected for work, the luggage, and the food supplies did not accompany them there. At SOBIB 6 are the gas chambers, were deep in the forest and not visible from the unloading ramp. But contrary to most order police denials, Fishman and his commando apparently entered the camp and watched the unloading. The order police, who guarded the deportation train from Katowice in Galicia, found the experience considerably more trying than the incident-free transport from Vienna. Indeed, in Galicia, where the Jews had been subjected to open-air massacres in the summer and fall of 1941, and to a first wave of deportations in the spring of 1942, the resumption of deportations in August 1942 clearly no longer entailed an unknown fate for many of the victims. In mid-September 1942, an order police captain of Reserve Police Battalion 133 in Police Regiment 24 reported on the experiences of 1 week of deportation operations. 7/Paul 24. Lemberg left bracket Loire right bracket, September 14, 1942 to Commander of the Order Police in the District of Galicia, Lemberg subject. Jewish resettlement. After carrying out Jewish resettlement actions on the 3d and 5th of September in Skolstry and Kotorov, for which captain of the Schutzpolizei Kroplin was in charge of the order police involved and which has already been reported in detail, the 7th Company of the 24th Police Regiment arrived as ordered in Katowice on the evening of September 6. I immediately contacted Criminal Commissar and SS Obersturmführer Leitmeritz, head of the branch office of the security police in Katowice, and First Lieutenant Hertel of the Schutzpolizei station in Katowice. Contrary to the experience in Stry, the action plan for September 7 in Katowice was well prepared and made easy for all units involved. The Jews had been informed by the above-mentioned agencies and the Labor Office to gather at the collection point of the Labor Office for registration on September 7 at 5:30 a.m. Some 5,300 Jews were actually assembled there at the appointed time. With all the manpower of my company, I sealed the Jewish quarter and searched thoroughly, whereby some 600 additional Jews were hunted down. The loading of the transport train was completed about 7 p.m. after the security police released some 1,000 from the total. Rounded up, 4,769 Jews were resettled. Each car of the transport was loaded with 100 Jews. The great heat prevailing that day made the entire action very difficult and greatly impeded the transport. After the regular nailing up and sealing of all cars, the transport train got underway to Belzec about 9 p.m. with a guard of 1 officer and 9 men. With the coming of deep darkness in the night, many Jews escaped by squeezing through the air holes after removing the barbed wire. While the guard was able to shoot many of them immediately, most of the escaping Jews were eliminated that night or the next day by the railroad guard or other police units. This transport was delivered in Bifzik without noteworthy incident, although given the length of the train and the deep darkness, the guard had proved to be too weak, as the commander of the transport guard from 6th Company of Police, Regiment 24, who returned directly to STANISLAW 6W, was able to report to me in person on September 11th. On September 8, some 300 Jews, old and weak, ill-frail, and no longer transportable, were executed. According to the order of September 4, of which I was first informed on September 6, concerning use of ammunition, 90% of all those executed were shot with carbines and rifles. Only in exceptional cases were pistols used. On September 8 and 10, actions in Kiri, Kasov, Horodenka Zaplatov, and Sniatin were carried out. Some 1,500 Jews had to be driven on foot marches, 50 kilometers from Kiri or 35 kilometers from Kasov to Kafamia, where they were kept overnight in the courtyard of the security police prison with the other Jews brought together from the region. Other than the Jews rounded up in Horodinka and Sniatin, who had already been loaded onto 10 cars at each location by the security police, another 30 cars were loaded in Kafamia. The total number sent to Belzec on the resettlement train of September 10 amounted to 8,205. In the actions in the area around Kafamia on September 8 and 10, some 400 Jews had to be eliminated by shooting for the well-known reasons. In the great roundup of Jews To be resettled by September 10th in Katamia, the security police loaded all Jews into the 30 available train cars, despite the objections I expressed. Given the great heat prevailing on those days, and the strain on the Jews from the long foot marches, or from waiting for days without being given any provisions worth noting, the excessively great overloading of most of the cars with 180 to 200 Jews was catastrophic in a way that had tremendously adverse effects on the transport. How densely the 10 cars each in Horodinka and Sniatin were loaded with Jews by the security police is beyond my knowledge. In any case, both transports arrived in Katamia with completely inadequate guard, so that the barbed wire closing the air holes was almost entirely removed. As quickly as possible I had this train moved out of the train station in Katamia and coupled with the 30 cars standing on a side track far from the station. The Jewish Police Ordnungsdienst and members of the train station construction crew from Katamia were employed until the onset of darkness to close up all the insufficiently sealed cars in the usual regulation manner. A commando of 1 officer and 15 men, under the leadership of Captain Zitzman, was assigned to guard the parked resettlement train of 50 cars until departure and to prevent any escape attempt. Given the already described strains on the Jews, the negative effect of the heat, and the great overloading of most of the cars, the Jews attempted time and again to break out of the parked train cars, as darkness had already set in toward 7:30 p.m. At 7:50 p.m., the guard commando of the resettlement train, with 9 men under Corporal Jack Line, arrived at the side track. Breakout attempts from the parked train could not be prevented in the darkness, nor could the escaping Jews be shot in flight. In all train cars, the Jews had completely undressed because of the heat. As the train left Katamia on schedule at 8:50 p.m., the guard took up their stations. The guard commando, as initially stipulated by me, was divided into 5 men in a passenger car at the front and 5 men in a passenger car at the end of the train. On account of the length of the train, and its total load of 8,205 Jews, this distribution proved to be unsuitable. Next time Corporal J will arrange a distribution of the guards along the entire train. Throughout the entire trip, the policemen had to remain in the cabooses, in order to be able to counter the escape attempts of the Jews. Shortly into the journey, the Jews attempted to break through the sides, and even through the ceilings of certain train cars. They were partially successful in perpetrating this scheme, so that already 5 stations before STANISLAW 6W Corporal J had to ask the station master in STANISLAW 6W by telephone to lay out nails and boards in order to seal the damaged cars as required by orders, and to request the station guard to watch the train. As the train entered STANISLAW 6W, the train station workers and the station guards were present to carry out the necessary repairs, and in addition take over guarding the train. The work took 1.5 hours. When the train subsequently resumed its journey, it was discovered at the next stop, some stations later, that once again large holes had been broken by the Jews in some of the train cars, and that for the most part the barbed wire fastened on the outside of the ventilation windows had been torn off. In one train car, the Jews had even been working with hammer and saw. Upon interrogation, they explained that the security police had left these tools with them because they could make good use of them at their next workplace. Corporal J made the Jews hand over the tools. During the further journey, at every station stop, help was needed to nail up the train, because otherwise the rest of the trip would not have been at all possible. At 11:15 am, the train reached Lemberg. Because no relief for the escort commando arrived, the escort commando J had to continue guarding the train until Belzec. After a brief halt at the Lemberg train station, the train continued to the suburban station of Klaperov, where 9 train cars, marked with the letter L and destined for the labor camp, were turned over to SS Obersturmführer Schultz and unloaded. SS Obersturmführer Schultz then had some additional 1,000 Jews loaded. About 1:30 p.m., the transport departed for Bifik. With the change of engine in Lemberg, such an old engine was hooked up that further travel was possible only with continuous interruptions. The slow journey was time and again used by the strongest Jews to press themselves through the holes they had forced open and to seek their safety in flight, because in jumping from the slow-moving train, they were scarcely injured. Despite the repeated requests to the engineer to go faster, this was not possible, so that the frequent stops on open stretches became increasingly unpleasant. Shortly beyond Lemberg, the commando had already shot off the ammunition they had with them, and also used up a further 200 rounds that they had received from army soldiers, so that for the rest of the journey, they had to resort to stones while the train was moving, and to fixed bayonets when the train was stopped. The ever greater panic spreading among the Jews due to the great heat, overloading of the train cars, and stink of dead bodies when unloading the train cars. Some 2,000 Jews were found dead in the train, made the transport almost unworkable. At 6:45 p.m., the transport arrived in Bifchik, and around 7:30 p.m. was turned over by Corporal J. to the SS Obersturmführer and head of the camp there. Until the unloading of the transport, around 10 p.m., J had to remain in the camp, while the escort commando was used to guard the train cars parked outside the camp. Because of the special circumstances described, the number of Jews who escaped from this transport cannot be specified. Nonetheless, it can be assumed that at least 2/3 of the escaping Jews were shot or rendered harmless in some other way. In the actions themselves, for the period of September 7 to 10, 1942, no special incidents occurred. The cooperation between the security police and the order police units involved was good, and without friction. Signed, Westermann, Reserve Lieutenant of the Schutzpolizei, and Company Commander 7. This document demonstrates many things: the desperate attempts of the deported Jews to escape the death train, the scanty manpower employed by the Germans, a mere 10 men to guard over 8,000 Jews, the unimaginably terrible conditions, forced marches over many miles, terrible heat, days without food and water, the packing of 200 Jews into each train car, etc. That led to fully 25% of the deported Jews dying on the train from suffocation, heat, prostration, and exhaustion, to say nothing of those killed in the shooting, which was so constant that the guards expended their entire ammunition supply, as well as replenishment. The casual mention that even before the deportations, hundreds of Jews, judged too old, frail, or sick to get to the train, were routinely shot in each action. Moreover, the document makes clear that this action was only one among many in which members of Reserve Police Battalion 133 participated alongside the security police in Galicia during the late summer of 1942. Such documents, however, do not tell us much that we would like to know about the grassroots perpetrators of the final solution. These men were not desk murderers, who could take refuge in distance, routine, and bureaucratic euphemisms that veiled the reality of mass murder. These men saw their victims face to face. Their comrades had already shot all the Jews deemed too weak to be deported, and they subsequently worked viciously for hours to prevent their victims from escaping the train, and hence the gas chambers awaiting them in Bizek. No one participating in the events described in this report could have had the slightest doubt about what he was involved in, namely a mass murder program to exterminate the Jews of Galicia. But how did these men first become mass murderers? What happened in the unit when they first killed? What choices, if any, did they have, and how did they respond? What happened to the men as the killing stretched on week after week, month after month? Documents like the one on the Kalamia transport give us a vivid snapshot of a single incident, but they do not reveal the personal dynamics of how a group of normal middle-aged German men became mass murderers. For that we must return to the story of Reserve Police Battalion 101. 5 Reserve Police Battalion 101. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Police Battalion 101, based in Hamburg, was one of the initial battalions attached to a German army group and sent to Poland. Crossing the border from Oppeln in Silesia, the battalion passed through Częstochowa to the Polish city of Kielce. There it was involved in rounding up Polish soldiers and military equipment behind German lines and guarding a prisoner of war camp. On December 17, 1939, the battalion returned to Hamburg, where about 100 of its career policemen were transferred to form additional units. They were replaced by middle-aged reservists drafted in the fall of 1939. In May 1940, after a period of training, the battalion was 38. Reserve Police Battalion 101/39, dispatched from Hamburg to the Warthegau, one of the 4 regions in western Poland annexed to the Third Reich as the incorporated territories. Stationed first in Poznary Posen until late June, and then in Lodz renamed Litzmannstadt by the victorious Germans, it carried out resettlement actions for a period of 5 months. As part of a demographic scheme of Hitler and Himmler's to Germanize these newly annexed regions, that is, to populate them with racially pure Germans, all Poles and other so-called undesirables, Jews and Gypsies, were to be expelled from the incorporated territories into central Poland. In accordance with provisions of an agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union, ethnic Germans living in Soviet territory were to be repatriated and resettled in the recently evacuated farms and apartments of the expelled Poles. The racial purification of the incorporated territories desired by Hitler and Himmler was never achieved, but hundreds of thousands of people were shoved around like so many pieces on a chessboard in pursuit of their vision of a racially reorganized Eastern Europe. The battalion's summary report boasted of its zealous partici passion in the resettlement. In actions night and day without pause, 100% of the battalion's strength was employed in all of the districts of the Warthegau. On the average, some 350 Polish peasant families were evacuated daily. During the peak of the evacuation period, they left the men of the battalion could not return to quarters for 8 days and nights. The men had the opportunity to sleep only while traveling at night by truck. In the biggest action, the battalion evacuated about 900 families. On one day with only its own forces and 10 translators. In all, the battalion evacuated 36,972 people out of a targeted 58,628. About 22,000 people escaped the evacuations by fleeing. 2. One drafted reservist, Bruno Probst * recalled the battalion's role in these actions. In the resettlement of the native population, primarily in the small villages, I experienced the first excesses and killings. It was always thus that with our arrival in the villages, the resettlement commission was already there. This so-called resettlement commission consisted of members of the black uniformed SS and SD as well as civilians. From them, we received cards with numbers. The houses of the village were also designated with the same numbers. The cards handed to us designated the houses that we were to evacuate. During the early period, we endeavored to fetch all people out of the houses, without regard for whether they were old, sick, or small children. The commission quickly found fault with our procedures. They objected that we struggled under the burden of the old and sick. To be precise, they did not initially give us the order to shoot them on the spot, rather they contented themselves with making it clear to us that nothing could be done with such people. In 2 cases I remember that such people were shot at the collection point. In the first case, it was an old man, and in the second case, an old woman. Both persons were shot not by the men, but by non-commissioned officers. 3 others in the battalion also remembered the resettlement actions, but no one else remembered or admitted to such violence. For one policeman did recall that the battalion had provided the security police with firing squads for the execution of 100 to 120 Poles during its stay in Poznary. 5. Following its 5-month resettlement campaign, the battalion carried out pacification actions. Combing villages and woods, they caught 750 Poles who had evaded the earlier evacuations. Pseudonyms are designated throughout by an asterisk at first occurrence. The Mijierzyk Transit Ghetto, liquidated in a series of 7 actions between August 1942 and July 1943. Lieutenant Nade's 2nd Company referred to Mijierzyk by the German nickname Fünfenschreck, or Human Horror, courtesy of the Jewish Historical Institute of Warsaw. I, Czechoslovakia BUD *PE *TMM *JL Hungary Romania POI. And in 1942 to 1943 William E. Greater than OIY of PTOI before Schoenberl, 1939 MH vertical bar fata PUUWD Turner less than AW less than J, by German. $11111 under Kempfree Adtenterretten. In most deportations, the Jews were instructed to take a few personal belongings with them to give credence to the cover story of resettlement. Lieutenant Nade's strip search was a clear sign that no one, neither policemen nor Jews, believed in this pretense any longer. Courtesy of the Jewish Historical Institute of Warsaw. After the strip search, the Jews were allowed to put their underclothes back on before being marched to the train station. At the undressing barracks, a stage in the deportation process, first introduced by Lieutenant Nade in the fall of 1942, when the Mijierzyk ghetto was subjected to a particularly brutal series of clearing operations, Order Police forced the Jews to strip and Order Police marched the MIKRZYRZEC Jews through town, May 26, 1943. The Jews deported to Majdanek that day would perish in the Ernstfest massacre of November 1943. The Lieutenant Nade, in front of his undressing barracks, in MIDZYRZEC, courtesy of Yad Vashem. Order Police stand guard in the marketplace during the 6th action, May 26, 1943, when 1,000 Jews were deported to the labor camp at Majdanek. In earlier Mijierzyk deportations, the Jews were sent directly to the gas chambers of Treblinka, courtesy of Yad Vashem. Their task was made more difficult because even the newly arrived ethnic Germans did not always report the unauthorized presence of the Poles they had displaced, wishing to avail themselves of cheap labor. On November 28, 1940, the battalion took up guard duty around the Lodz ghetto, which had been sealed 7 months earlier, at the end of April 1940, when the 160,000 Jews of Lodz were cut off from the rest of the city by a barbed wire fence. Guarding the ghetto now became the major duty of Police Battalion 101, which had a standing order to shoot without further ado any Jew who ignored the posted warnings and came too close to the fence. This order was obeyed. None of Battalion 101's men, however, remembered excesses such as occurred while the 1st Company of Police Battalion 61 was guarding the Warsaw ghetto. There the company captain openly encouraged shooting at the ghetto wall. The most notorious shooters were not rotated to other duties but were kept permanently on ghetto guard duty. The company recreation room was decorated with racist slogans, and a Star of David hung above the bar. A mark was made on the bar door for each Jew shot, and victory celebrations were reportedly held on days when high scores were recorded. Stationed outside the ghetto wire, the battalion members had more contact with the non-Jewish population than with the incarcerated Jews. Bruno Probst recalled that the guards on the thoroughfare that cut between the two halves of the Lodz ghetto occasionally amused themselves by setting their watches ahead as a pretext for seizing and beating Poles who were allegedly violating the curfew. He also recalled that drunken guards, intending to kill a Pole on New Year's Eve, shot an ethnic German by mistake and covered it up by switching the victim's identity card. In May 1941 the battalion returned to Hamburg and was practically dissolved. All remaining pre-war recruits beneath the rank of non-commissioned officer were distributed to other units, and the ranks were filled with drafted reservists. The battalion had become, in the words of one policeman, a pure reserve battalion. During the next year, from May 1941 to June 1942, the battalion was reformed and underwent extensive training. Only a few incidents from this period remained in the memories of the men. One was the bombing of Lübeck in March 1942. 4 units of the battalion were sent to the damaged city immediately afterward. 11 another involved the deportation of Hamburg Jews. From mid-October 1941 to late February 1942, 59 transports carried more than 53,000 Jews and 5,000 Gypsies from the Third Reich to the east, in this case L60, Riga, Kovno, Kaunas and Minsk. The 5 transports to Kovno, and the first transport to Riga, were massacred upon arrival. 12 the remaining transports were not liquidated immediately. Rather, the deportees were initially incarcerated in the ghettos of L60, where the 5,000 Austrian gypsies were sent Minsk and Riga. 4 such transports that were spared immediate death came from Hamburg. The first, with 1,034 Jews, departed on October 25, 1941, for Lodz. The second, with 990 Jews, left for Minsk on November 8. The third, with 408 Jews from Hamburg and 500 from Bremen, left for Minsk on November 18. The fourth left Hamburg for Riga, with 808 Jews, on December 4. 13 men from Reserve Police Battalion 101 were involved in various phases of the Hamburg deportations. The collection point for the deportations was the Freemason Lodge House on the Moorweide, which had been confiscated by the security police. Flanked by the university library and an apartment block within several hundred yards of the heavily used Damter train station, the collection point was scarcely an inconspicuous location out of the sight of Hamburg citizens. Some order police of Battalion 101 provided guard duty at the Freemason Lodge House, where the Jews were collected, registered, and loaded on trucks to the Sternschanze train station. 14 other men of Battalion 101 guarded the station, where the Jews were loaded onto the trains. 15 and finally, Battalion 101 provided the escort for at least 3 of the 4 transports, the first, on October 25 to L60Z, the second, on November 8 to Minsk, and the last, on December 4 to Riga. 16 According to Hans Keller, escort duty on the Jewish transports was highly coveted because of the chance to travel, and was assigned only to a favored few. 17 Bruno Probst, who accompanied the November 8 transport to Minsk, recalled, "In Hamburg the Jews were told at the time that they would be allocated a whole new settlement territory in the east. The Jews were loaded into normal passenger cars, accompanied by 2 cars of tools, shovels, axes, etc., as well as large kitchen equipment. For the escort commando, a second-class carriage was attached. There were no guards in the cars of the Jews themselves. The train had to be guarded on both sides only at stops. After about 4 days' journey we reached Minsk in the late afternoon. We learned of this destination for the first time only during the journey, after we had already passed Warsaw. In Minsk an SS commando was waiting for our transport. Again without guard, the Jews were then loaded onto the waiting trucks. Only their baggage, which they had been allowed to bring from Hamburg, had to be left behind in the train. They were told it would follow. Then our commando was finally driven to a Russian barracks, in which an active left bracket, i.e. not reserve right bracket, German Police Battalion was lodged. There was a Jewish camp nearby. From conversations with members of the above-mentioned police battalion we learned that some weeks ago this unit had already shot Jews in Minsk. We concluded from this fact that our Hamburg Jews were to be shot there also. Not wanting to be involved, the escort's commander, Lieutenant Hartwig Knade, did not remain at the barracks. Instead he and his men returned to the station, and took a late-night train out of Minsk 18. We have no description of the escort duty to Riga from Hamburg, but the Salator report on the order police escort of the December 11th Jewish transport from Dusseldorf to Riga provides graphic evidence that policemen there learned as much as the Hamburg policemen did in Minsk. As Salator noted, Riga consisted of some 360,000 inhabitants, including some 35,000 Jews. The Jews were everywhere dominant in the business world. Their businesses were nonetheless immediately closed and confiscated after the entry of German troops. The Jews themselves were lodged in a ghetto on the Dvina left bracket Dvina right bracket that was sealed by barbed wire. At the moment only 2,500 male Jews, who are used for labor, are said to be in the ghetto. The other Jews have either been sent to similar employment elsewhere, or shot by the Latvians. They left bracket the Latvians right bracket hate the Jews in particular. From the time of liberation to the present, they have participated very amply in the extermination of these parasites. It is, however, incomprehensible to them, as I was especially able to discover from Latvian railway personnel, why the Germans bring their Jews to Latvia instead of exterminating them in their own country. 19 In June 1942, Reserve Police Battalion 101 was assigned another tour of duty in Poland. By then, only a few non-commissioned officers who had been on the first Polish action remained, and less than 20% of the men had been on the second, in the Warthegau. A few of these had witnessed what they called excesses in Poznan and Lodz. A few more had accompanied one of the Hamburg Jewish transports to Lodz, Minsk, or Riga. At the latter two destinations, as we have seen, it was difficult not to learn something about the mass murder of Jews in Russia. But for the most part, Reserve Police Battalion 101 was now composed of men without any experience of German occupation methods in Eastern Europe, or for that matter, with the exception of the very oldest, who were World War I veterans, any kind of military service. The battalion consisted of 11 officers, 5 administrative officials in charge of financial matters relating to pay, provisioning, lodging, etc., and 486 non-commissioned officers and men 20 to reach full strength. Some non-Hamburg contingents were added at the last minute from nearby Wilhelmshaven and Rendsburg in Schleswig-Holstein, and from distant Luxembourg. Still, the vast majority of the rank and file had been born and reared in Hamburg and its environs. The Hamburg element was so dominant, and the ethos of the battalion so provincial, that not just the Luxembourgers, but also the contingents from Wilhelmshaven and Rendsburg felt themselves to be outsiders. 21 The battalion was divided into 3 companies, each of approximately 140 men, when at full strength. 2 companies were commanded by police captains, the third by the senior reserve lieutenant in the battalion. Each company was divided into 3 platoons, 2 of them commanded by reserve lieutenants, and the third by the platoon's senior sergeant. Each platoon was divided into 4 squads, commanded by a sergeant or corporal. The men were equipped with carbines, the non-commissioned officers with submachine guns. Each company also had a heavy machine gun detachment. Apart from the 3 companies, there was the personnel of the battalion staff, which included, in addition to the 5 administrative officials, a doctor and his aide, as well as various drivers, clerks and communication specialists. The battalion was commanded by 53-year-old Major Wilhelm Trapp, a World War I veteran and recipient of the Iron Cross First Class. After the war he became a career policeman, and rose through the ranks. He had recently been promoted from captain of 2nd Company, and this was his first battalion command. Though Trapp had joined the Nazi Party in December 1932 and thus technically qualified as an old party fighter or alter Kämpfer, he had never been taken into the SS or even given an equivalent SS rank, in spite of the fact that Himmler and Heydrich consciously tried to merge and intertwine the state and party components of their SS and police empire. Trapp was clearly not considered SS material. He was soon to come into conflict with his 2 captains, both young SS men, who even in their testimony, more than 20 years later, made no attempt to conceal their contempt for their commander, as weak unmilitary, and unduly interfering in the duties of his officers. 22 The 2 police captains, who also held the equivalent SS rank of Hauptsturmführer, were young men, in their late 20s. Wolfgang Hoffmann, Baum in 1914, had joined the National Socialist Student Union NS Schülerbund in 1930 as a 16-year-old, the Hitler Youth in 1932 at 18, and the SS 1 year later, all before he had graduated from Gymnasium, a college preparatory high school, in 1934. He joined the police force in Breslau in 1936 and entered the Nazi Party in 1937. The same year he completed officer training and was commissioned as a lieutenant of the Schutzpolizei. He joined Reserve Police Battalion 101 in the spring of 1942. The following June, at the age of 28, he was promoted to the rank of captain. 23. He commanded 3rd Company. Julius Wolof, born in 1913, graduated from Gymnasium in 1932. In April 1933, he joined the Nazi Party, and saw in 1936 he joined the SS, and the same year, he began his training to become a police officer. He was commissioned a lieutenant of the Schutzpolizei in 1938. He too was assigned to Reserve Police Battalion 101 in early 1942 and was promoted to captain in June 1942, just before the departure for Poland. 24. He commanded 1st Company and served as Trapp's deputy battalion commander. In contrast to the elderly Trapp, Hoffelmann and Wolof represented precisely the combination of well-educated professional police officer, early enthusiast for National Socialism, and young SS member that was the Himmler-Heydrich ideal for the SS and police. Trapp's adjutant was 1st Lieutenant Hagen *, about whom little is known, except that he was killed in the spring of 1943. In addition, the battalion had 7 reserve lieutenants, that is men, who were not career policemen, like Hoffelmann and Wolof, but were selected to receive officer training, after they were drafted into the order police because of their middle-class status. Education and success in civilian life. From oldest to youngest, they were Hartwig Nade, born 1894, a forwarding agent and Nazi Party member since 1937, commander of 2nd Company. Paul Brand *, born 1902. Heinz Buchmann *, born 1904, owner of a family lumber business, party member since 1937. Oscar Peters *, born 1905. Walter Hoppner *, born 1908, tea importer, party member briefly in 1930, rejoined in the spring of 1933. Hans Scheer *, born 1908, and a party member since May 1933. Kurt Drucker *, born 1909, a salesman and party member since 1939. 25. Thus their ages ranged from 33 to 48. 5 were party members, but none belonged to the SS. Of the 32 non-commissioned officers, on whom we have information, 22 were party members and 7 were in the SS. They ranged in age from 27 to 40 years old. Their average age was 33 and a half. They were not reservists, but rather pre-war recruits to the police. Of the rank and file, the vast majority were from the Hamburg area. About 63% were of working class background, but few were skilled laborers. The majority of them held typical Hamburg working class jobs. Dock workers and truck drivers were most numerous, but there were also many warehouse and construction workers, machine operators, seamen, and waiters. About 35% were lower middle class, virtually all of them white-collar workers. 3/4 were in sales of some sort. The other 1/4 performed various office jobs in both the government and private sector. The number of independent artisans and small businessmen was very small. Only a handful, 2%, were middle-class professionals, and very modest ones, at that, such as druggists and teachers. The average age of the men was 39. Over half were between 37 and 42, a group considered too old for the army, but most heavily conscripted for reserve police duty after September 1939. 26 among the rank and file policemen, about 25%, 43, from a sample of 174, were party members in 1942. 6 were Altkämpfer, who had joined the party before Hitler came to power. Another 6 joined in 1933. Despite the domestic ban on new party members, from 1933 to 1937, another 6 men who worked aboard ships were admitted by the party section for members living overseas. 16 joined in 1937, when the ban on new membership was lifted. The remaining 9 joined in 1939 or later. The men of lower middle class background held party membership in an only slightly higher proportion, 30%, than those from the working class, 25%. 27 The men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 were from the lower orders of German society. They had experienced neither social nor geographic mobility. Very few were economically independent. Except for apprenticeship or vocational training, virtually none had any education after leaving Volksterminal Secondary School at age 14 or 15. By 1942, a surprisingly high percentage had become party members. However, because the interrogating officials did not record such information, we do not know how many had been communists, socialists, and or labor union members before 1933. Presumably a not insignificant number must have been, given their social origins. By virtue of their age, of course, all went through their formative period in the pre-Nazi era. These were men who had known political standards and moral norms other than those of the Nazis. Most came from Hamburg, by reputation one of the least Nazified cities in Germany, and the majority came from a social class that had been anti-Nazi in its political culture. These men would not seem to have been a very promising group from which to recruit mass murderers on behalf of the Nazi vision of a racial utopia free of Jews. Sometime in the summer of 1941, after the onslaught against Russian Jewry was underway, Himmler confided to the SS and police leader in Lublin, Odilo Gluboknik, Hitler's intention to murder the Jews of Europe as well. Moreover, Himmler put Gluboknik in charge of the single most important element of this final solution to the Jewish question in Europe, the destruction of the Jews of the general government who constituted the bulk of Polish Jewry. A method different from the firing squad operations used against Russian Jewry was deemed essential for the murder of European Jews, however one that was more efficient, less public, and less burdensome psychologically for the killers. The organizational and technological answer to these needs was the extermination camp. The victims would be deported to special camps where, by virtue of assembly line procedures, requiring very limited manpower, most of it prisoner labor, they would be gassed in relative secrecy. Preparations for gassing began at 3 locations in the fall of 1941. Auschwitz/Birkenau near Katowice, in Silesia, and Cheno, near L60, in the Warthegau, both in the incorporated territories, and Betik in Gluboknik's Lublin district. Large-scale gassing began at Cheno in early December 1941 and at Birkenau in mid-February 1942. One gassing at Gluboknik's camp at Betik did not begin until mid-March 1942. The task Gluboknik faced was enormous, but he was given virtually no manpower to accomplish it. For expertise and assistance in building and operating the extermination center at Bifchik, Gluboknik was able to draw on personnel from the euthanasia program in Germany, but this was a handful of men that at its maximum never exceeded 100. This number by itself was insufficient to staff a single extermination camp, and 2 more were yet to be built by Gluboknik at Sobib, 6R and Treblinka. But the extermination camps were not Gluboknik's biggest problem. Far more pressing was the manpower required to clear the ghettos, to round up the victims, and force them onto the death trains. In the Lublin district alone there were nearly 300,000 Jews. In all of the general government, about 2 million. While Germany's military fate hung in the balance, in the crucial year of 1942, where were the men for such a staggering logistical task? In fact, aside from the assignment itself, Himmler gave Gluboknik virtually nothing, and he had to improvise. He had to create private armies out of his own resources and ingenuity to accomplish the task with which Himmler had entrusted him. For the coordination of the mass murder campaign against Polish Jewry, dubbed Operation Reinhard after Reinhard Heydrich was slain in Czechoslovakia in June 1942, Gluboknik formed a special staff under his deputy and fellow Austrian Hermann Hoffel. The key people on this staff included Christian Wirth and his adjutant, Joseph Oberhauser, in charge of the extermination centers, Helmuth Pohl, another Austrian, in charge of incoming transports, Georg Michelson, Kurt Klassen, and yet another Austrian, Ernst Lerch, to oversee and often personally conduct operations in the field, and Sorg Wippern, in charge of collecting, sorting, and utilizing the Jewish property collected at the extermination camps and in the vacated ghettos. As the SS and police leader in the Lublin district, Gluboknik was responsible for coordinating all regional operations that involved the joint action of mixed SS units. Thus the entire SS and police network in the Lublin district, though already stretched thin, was at his disposal. Most important, this meant the 2 branches of the security police, Gestapo and Kripo, on the one hand, and various units of the order police on the other. In addition to its main headquarters in the city of Lublin, the security police had 4 branch offices in the district. Each contained a Gestapo section for Jewish affairs. The presence of the order police was felt in 3 ways. First, each of the major towns in the Lublin district had a Schutzpolizei agency. Included in its responsibilities was the supervision of the Polish municipal police. Second, scattered throughout the towns in the countryside were small detachments of gendarmerie. Finally, 3 battalions of Order Police were stationed in the Lublin district. The security police branches, along with the Schutzpolizei and gendarmerie units, provided small numbers of policemen who knew the local conditions. But the 3 Order Police battalions, totaling 1,500 men, represented the single largest police manpower pool Gluboknik could draw on. Clearly they were indispensable, but still not sufficient to meet his needs. Gluboknik also utilized 2 other sources of manpower. The first was the Sonderdienst Special Service, composed of small units of ethnic Germans, who had been mobilized and trained after the German conquest and assigned to the head of the civil administration in each county of the district in the summer of 1942. Second, and far more important, were the so-called Trauernikus. Unable to satisfy his manpower needs out of local resources, Gluboknik prevailed upon Himmler to recruit non-Polish auxiliaries from the Soviet border regions. The key person on Gluboknik's Operation Reinhard staff for this task was Karl